Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Upasana Ghosh, and I'm a postgraduate student of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development of Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. It's an honor to welcome all the dignitaries and all the participants today on the sixth day of the international webinar on human rights and vulnerable groups jointly organized by the Department of Human Rights and Human Development and the Department of Disability Studies of Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. As we making this event more and more engaging, we will be looking forward to make today's session equally engaging and informative as well. To begin with, I would at first like to invite Dr. Payal Rai Chaudhuri Dutt, the coordinator of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development, to deliver the welcome address and introduce our eminent resource persons with the participants. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, you are mute and please turn on your camera. Yes.
Is this better?
Ma'am, we can't see
Can
you.
oh, can you see me now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Upasna. Thank you to Victoria, Abhishek, Pubali, Taruk, Parveen for getting us through all the technical glitches and for holding this program together.
You are not visible.
Is it so?
Yes, ma'am. Your camera is getting off. Your camera is getting off again
Oh,
and
is it?
again.
Okay. So is
Yes,
this
ma'am.
and now? Now is this better?
Ma'am, you are frozen.
Can I be heard now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, am I audible and am I seen? Okay. Upasna, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. I can hear you. Sorry for this technical glitches. We will be right back within few minutes. We are working on the technical issues. Please be patient. Please have patience and be with us. Okay.
That.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So sorry about the technical.
Okay, ma'am.
Can we please continue?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I would like to request you to kindly deliver the welcome address and introduce our eminent resource persons with the participants. Over to you, ma'am.
Well, thank you very much, Upasna, and I apologize to all our viewers, to all the esteemed resource persons and the participants for the technical error on my end. This is exactly how age shows up on a person, I think. Well, once again, a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of us who are watching us right now on YouTube live stream. And thank you for signing up for this virtual conference from around the world. Now, we have seen in the previous days how the implication of the pandemic stands very pronounced. And more than halfway through this webinar, we continue to explore vulnerability in the context of an unprecedented global challenge that has worsened inequalities like never before. Now, context of bringing in today's resource, let us look at the coronavirus disease in how it has affected very disproportionately the racial and the ethnic minority groups. And there have been already very high rates of deaths and disabilities. Now, although the mechanism of these disparities are being investigated, there are, of course, a number of biomedical factors as much as there are social determinants why this has resulted. And the reason that the minority groups are so disproportionately affected is perhaps also linked with the lesser access towards medical conditions, healthcare that will portend worse COVID 19 outcomes. Also, remember that minority communities, racial or ethnic, are more likely to experience living and working conditions that predispose them already to worse outcomes. So, the long standing structural and societal factors uh, have perhaps been exposed like never before in the context of the pandemic with regard to the ethnic and racial minorities. To discuss, of course, these matters, we have amongst us very eminent resource persons, both former professors in the areas of international relations and political science, and both perhaps having taught at the postgraduate level for about 3 to 4 decades, if not more. Both writing also extensively on themes of marginalization, minorities, human rights, Dalits, and oppression. And of course, both have also been published nationally and internationally very, very widely. So I am quite simply quite happy to have the first speaker as Professor Debi Chatterjee, who was also my teacher in my postgraduate days of human rights at Calcutta University. And we thank you and with very deep regard, ma'am, welcome you to this international webinar. And a special thanks to you for agreeing to chair the subsequent session as well. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to the very quintessential teacher and thorough researcher with a great smile, Professor Bonita Elias, who, despite a very difficult time in her family, even as we speak, has found herself compelled through her passion to this subject to be with us here today. Welcome you, Bonita, too, and thank you so much. And especially warm welcome to all the paper presenters for today. We look forward to hearing you and hearing you with much earnestness. Welcome you all once again to this very august occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for elucidating the day's subject quite efficiently. It's a privilege to be here today and to represent the dignities from different fields. Today, we will be inviting lectures and presentations on ethnic and racial minorities from various resource persons, students, and professionals. Well, before proceeding to the invited lectures, I would like to brief the participants that we will be welcoming your questions on each lecture as well as presentation, which you can drop on the comment section while the respective person is performing and as soon as they finish. To move on with, I would now like to solicit Professor Devi Chatterjee, former coordinator of postgraduate diploma course in Human Rights and Duties Education of the Department of International Relations of Jadavpur University, Kolkata. Also, she contributed as a guest lecturer in the Department of Sociology of Calcutta University and in the Human Rights Program under the Department of Anthropology of Calcutta University. Her special areas of interest includes human rights, Indian society and social problems, Dalit movements, thoughts and struggles against caste, Marxist ideas and movements in India, particularly gender issues and public administration. She wrote quite a number of books, which includes Dalit Rights and Human Rights, Ideas and Movements Against Caste in India from Ancient to Modern Times, Up Against Caste, that is a comparative study of Ambedkar and Periyar, Sociology of National Integration, Marxist Thought in India, and Color Volcano. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this international webinar on the human rights of vulnerable groups. I feel extremely honored for getting this opportunity of speaking at this very prestigious program. I have a long association with Rabindra Bharati University, and it really gives me an immense pleasure to be amongst you today on this occasion. I shall be talking about the tribes of India. Amongst India's most vulnerable population groups are the tribes of India. Now, when we look at vulnerability and human rights, to start with, I would say, vulnerable sections, their rights violations are more frequent, more intense, more brutal, and occur more regularly. Or in other words, their overall vulnerability makes them particularly vulnerable when it comes to the question of human rights. They are much more victims of human rights violations. And with that, I would come to the question of tribes. India has a large tribal population, over 8%. As far as the latest census, 2011 census report goes, it is 8.6% of India's population. Now, we tend to categorize tribes as a whole. Is this tribal population is not a homogeneous tribal population. We need to remember that. We also seem to club together at another point the tribal population with certain other vulnerable sections of India's population, and very frequently the scheduled castes. We speak of the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. But here I would say that there again, we've got to remain aware of the fact that there are certain basic differences in the vulnerabilities of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. For a variety of reasons, these two population groups are also very often read together, clubbed together, but they are not identical. These are points, I think, that need to be highlighted right at the beginning. As I said, when we speak of India's 8.6% tribal population, there are numerous tribal communities. They are very diverse. They are not identical. And various attempts have been made by scholars to classify them. Classification attempts have been made along lines of their geographical habitation. In this context, let me point out, unlike the castes that are scattered across the country, tribes have certain pockets where their concentration is high. Of course, they are found across the country, but there are certain essentially tribal pockets where you have a large section of members of the tribal communities residing. So attempts have been made to geographically classify them along their places of habitation, taking note of their places of habitation. Attempts have been made, for example, to see the tribes of the Northeast, tribes of Central India, the tribes living in the island regions, the Andaman Nicobar regions, etc. Tribes living in peninsular India. Now, apart from geographical classifications, we have classified tribes. Scholars have tried to do that along their racial lines, their ethnic lines. And broadly, they have emphasized three categories here of classification: the Negrito, those of the Negrito origin, the variety, those who are identified as the Proto-Australoids, those who are identified as the Mongoloids. So attempts at ethnic classification have been made. Attempts are made to classify them in terms of the occupation which they are in. And that, again, is a very, very wide range, as we all know. Some tribes are at the level of hunting gathering still, whereas some tribes are at the level of advanced settled agriculture for a very long time. Some have moved to semi-urban areas, industrial regions. Some have moved to the urban areas, working in offices even. So there, occupationally, you have a very wide range in terms of occupation. Classification also goes on in terms of what or how they relate to their neighboring non-tribal populations, and predominantly, again, the Hindu population. Are they close to the Hindu population? Are they close to the caste structure of society? Are they semi-Hinduized, in other words? Or do they reject completely the Hindu ethos altogether? Or are they indifferent to the Hindu ethos? So you will find a wide range again here. So remember the variety. Remember the variety that we are really looking at, and you can understand that depending on the variety, their problems, their vulnerabilities, etc., will also be very, very different. Similarly, at the And we need to remember the extent of autonomy that the tribes enjoy. Now, keeping this backdrop in mind, let us look at the problem areas of the tribes. What makes them so vulnerable, or from when is this vulnerability of the tribes a reality? These are questions that have to be taken up very seriously. The roots of vulnerability of the Indian tribal population are not recent. Right from the British days, the tribes have been exploited. Exploited by the British authorities, marginalized, and exploited by non-tribal populations, forests, etc. Now, traditionally, the tribal population in India, as in different parts of the world, have had a very close link with nature. They have maintained a very close link with nature, with forest areas, drawing their livelihood from forests, living in close proximity to the forests, having community claims on land. Now, all these were curtailed from the time of British rule. As the British were establishing control over forests, land, etc., tribals were being pushed out from their traditional sources of livelihood and much more. I emphasize this word much more here because it was not simply a question of livelihood. It was also a question of emotional attachments, a cultural attachment that the people of the tribal communities had and have with the forests, with the lands of their ancestors. So it's much more than simply sources of livelihoods being lost. Now, this encroachment was a continuous process through the British period. The attitude of the British authorities was, on the one hand, oppression, ad hoc handling of the situations, and ruthless oppression. If you look at the record of Indian history, you will find that there have been many instances of tribal put down. We all know that, those who have explored a bit of Indian history would be aware of that. Now, from there, drawing on that history, let us see what happened post-independence. What was happening? Now, India's policy post-independence regarding the tribal community was, on the one hand, I would say, governed by the basic democratic norms that were being promoted by the Constitution. Theoretically, like other sections of the population, India's tribal population was entitled to all the rights that other non-tribal citizens were to enjoy. They were also recognized as having special needs, listed as scheduled tribes, and those tribes in the lists or in the schedule were entitled to certain special treatment. certain support mechanisms along with the scheduled castes. So we tend
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, you are not audible. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In the Constitution, you will find provisions for development of tribal areas as well. And these have also been included in the Constitution. So there are certain general provisions that the rights that the tribes are entitled to as citizens, along with other citizens of the country on an equal footing. There are certain special provisions that are made for them individually, which they can enjoy as members of the scheduled tribes who have been listed for special treatment. As residing in scheduled areas, where they live in scheduled areas, certain special provisions are there for the development of scheduled areas. So the Constitution does have a host of provisions whereby the tribal population can enjoy a variety of rights and safeguards to ensure them that their human rights are not violated. Now, to start with, the basic norms that had governed the development of the tribes or the handling of their situation were evolved by Jawaharlal Nehru. These norms were that regarding their administration, tribals should be allowed to develop along the lines of their own genius. One. Secondly, their rights in lands and forests should be respected. Thirdly, they should form the majority of personnel in tribal development administration. Fourthly, there should be an avoidance of over-administration. And fifthly, results should be judged by the quality of human character. Now, these were the basic principles that the administration was guided to follow regarding the tribal population of India. And Nehru was greatly inspired by the works of Elvin. And here we have to note that this was a good approach overall, an approach of caution, I would say, that there was regarding how much administration should interfere in tribal affairs by trying to administer tribal areas, and at the same time that it should not be an intrusion into tribal lives. A balanced approach was considered to be very important. So when you look at the constitutional provisions, when you look at Nehru's principles, which were in the from the beginning, which set the tone, I would say, for tribal administration, the administration of tribal regions. They were substantial measures that were being adopted for the development of the tribal population. I'm not going into the detailed constitutional articles here. We would not have the time to look into that. But if you looked at the 5-year plans, if you looked at the tribal development schemes, the resources which were being devoted for tribal development, well, all this was being done. All this was being done. Yet, I would say there has been a big gap between the vision, the constitutional provisions, and the reality. Tribes remain extremely vulnerable. They are marginalized across the country in a variety of ways. Their discontent is clearly evident when you're looking at India's tribal population. Their vulnerability, their discontent becomes very clearly evident to any researcher who cares to explore the areas. Now, what are the root causes? I have already mentioned that there's a variety we are looking at, a wide range. So when you're looking at the wide range, naturally the problems are also diverse, the issues are also diverse. But there are certain broad areas that can be identified as common issue areas. At one level, I would say, there is the problem of land and forest, an unresolved problem drawing from the British days that I have referred to already. The population of the tribes are still today being displaced from these rights. Even while on the one hand, the rights of the tribal population as forest dwellers are being recognized by laws, the tribes suffer. For the simple reason that it is now the state which will or will not recognize the rights of a member of a tribe. Think of the situation. The extent of rights that they may enjoy would be sanctioned by law. It is a right that the state would permit a member of a tribal community to enjoy. In an area which traditionally they believed was given to them by their ancestors, by their gods over generations. An inherited ownership, an inherited sense of ownership is now being pushed into an area where a right, within quotes, I would say, a right may be conceded to a greater or lesser extent, or may not even be conceded. So the basic sense of denial there is very acute. It is centering around the forest that the tribals enjoy much of their cultural symbols. The forests, the rivers, the animals inhabiting the forests, all these are part of tribal culture. and limiting the access to the forests for different reasons means limiting or restricting these cultural symbols. Similarly, despite the fact that there are laws in different parts of the country to protect the rights of the tribes in relation to their lands, there has been a steady erosion of the rights of members of the tribal communities in relation to lands. When we are looking at poverty indicators, we would find the tribal population is extremely poor. If you look at health indicators, you will find, in terms of health indicators, the tribal population suffers from malnutrition and a variety of ailments that are associated with lack of nourishment and poverty. So these are certain areas that we need to identify. Cultural oppression has many facets. I have already mentioned the fact that India's tribal population is, the different tribal communities are extremely autonomous. They enjoy a variety of autonomy or claim a variety of autonomy so far as their culture goes. There is a constant sense of losing out this cultural autonomy, a sense of loss of their cultural freedom. Education in their mother tongue is scarce and hardly available. The symbols that are there in the educational field that are used to educate the children are not the symbols of the tribal communities. So that leads to a sense of alienation from the surrounding milieu, a disinterest in the educational system. The poverty makes them vulnerable in the field of agriculture. Bonded labor is a reality for them. In the industrial area, we will find they are working as casual labor. A very major problem is the problem of displacement. Think of India's industrial belts in central India. Think of the large industrial belts in central India. These are also the belts of habitation of sizable sections of different tribal communities. If you look at Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, for example, they account for 70% of India's coal reserves, 80% of high-grade iron ore, 60% of India's bauxite, and almost 10% of chromite reserves. And over the years, we find that a large section of the tribal population from this region has been evicted. Those who are evicted, around 40 to 50% of them belong to tribal communities. They have been evicted for purposes of industrialization, mining, etc. So the eviction of the tribal population, the displacement of the tribal population that takes place, partly is illegal in different parts of the country. Partly it is legal for different projects. for building of dams, massive eviction of tribal populations have taken place. You are all familiar with the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which drew in a sizable section of the tribal population into the movement, which was taking up the cause of the displaced. So across the country, we find that many big dams have been built. There are many dam projects. And of these dam projects, again, about 40 to 50% are the tribal people who get displaced. In certain cases, you will notice that they suffer a double displacement. Those who get displaced once somehow find a place to live in later, find for themselves, I would say, a place where they can find a shelter for themselves, from where they again get displaced for a different reason once more, for building of roads, for housings, etc. So a second displacement. Compensation sometimes comes in late, sometimes does not come in at all. Cash compensation hardly meets their requirements. An alternative place of habitation hardly solves their problems. Because in a new place, pushed to a new place, generally they lose the links that they had developed over generations with the area in which they had been living. New sources of livelihood, emotional trauma, all come with the displacement. And they are, in every sense of the term, worse off. So displacement is another major problem that the tribal population has to face here. So here we've got to understand certain basic problem areas. One, when we look at the human rights scenario of India's tribal population, at the core of their poverty, their sense of loss of identity, their sense of loss of their cultural symbols, a sense of encroachment from others, the non-tribal milieu around them, generates a resistance, generates a sense of threat and discontent. And these are manifest at different points of time, in different parts of the country, in different ways. Sometimes it comes in the form of statehood demands. Sometimes there are agitations which are militant. Sometimes they are constitutionally structured within the constitutional frame. In different ways, they agitate and manifest their discontent. Now here, we thus find that tribals are vulnerable. Tribals have been losing out from the British days in terms of their rights of land and forests, etc. They are victims of economic marginalization. They're at the lowest end when you're looking at the field of agriculture, landless labor, or have very small holdings today. Or when you're looking at the urban areas or semi-urban areas, the industrial belts, you will find them largely as casual labor at the lowest end of the industrial unit. Mind you, in regions where even if they were not rich, they had a sense of ownership. They owned the land on which the industry builds up, or in which the mining is being done, where the tribal person is now working according to the dictates of the superiors. That placement low down in the hierarchy becomes traumatic in a region where they were the bosses of the land. So that sense of loss, we've got to understand how that sense of loss manifests itself, how that vulnerability, how that vulnerability has to be considered. It is not just economic loss. It is not just economic loss. It is much more than that, though it is surely economic loss. It is a loss of human rights in terms of livelihood, in terms of health resources, and in terms of emotional trauma, which I have repeatedly been trying to emphasize. A sense of alienation afflicts them. India, the India which they interact with, seems to be not their India, yet it has been their India, and on paper it is surely their India that they are in. So it's a very, very complex scenario that we are looking at. Now, when we are looking at this scenario, we've got to understand that addressing it is not simply a matter of addressing human rights issues piecemeal. It is a much bigger question that we are really confronted with. It is a question of development models. It is a question of an alternative logic or an alternative rationality that we have to take up very seriously. The development model that has been pursued over all these years has largely been the Western industrialization, big industry-based development model. From the 90s, with globalization, it has again flourished more ruthlessly, I would say, with greater speed. And in this process, those in the margins get even more marginalized. And they have been thrown off even more ruthlessly and without consideration for their interests, in the interests of developing the modern India, the developed India. That developed India does not have space for the vulnerable sections. That developed India does not reckon with the requirements of these vulnerable sections of India's population. That development line, at a point, I would say, also makes India, however, the entire India and the developed India, vulnerable as a whole to the present COVID situation. It makes the world vulnerable to the COVID situation. Today, questions are being raised. Today, questions are being raised about how ruthlessly we have exploited nature in the interest of supposed human development, which has been wrongly read. A major rethinking is being demanded in the light of the COVID experience for the survival of humankind. Is it also not relevant to say that this major rethinking is necessary in the interest specifically of India's tribal population and, of course, of ethnic populations across the world? An alternative, in other words, it is time to think of the alternatives on an emergency basis. It is wrong to think that the path of
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, your screen got frozen. You are not audible properly.
is in the interest of
I
India's
think
tribal.
there is some technical glitches. Hello, ma'am.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear now. Ma'am, you have 3 minutes to wrap up.
Right. I'm just wrapping up the last 2 or 3
Okay,
sentences.
okay.
I'm just wrapping
Thank
up.
you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
So it is important to look at these vulnerable sections as indicators of what is happening, and that we need an alternative discourse, an alternative rationality, or maybe several alternative lines of development need to be seriously explored, not just critiquing the present line, but to show guidelines for how to proceed, to draw in these vulnerable sections into the development paradigm as equal partners. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas.
Thank you, ma'am, for
Thank
sharing
you.
such useful information with all of us. It was not only uprising, but equally engrossing. Now, I would like to introduce Professor Bonita Alias, former professor of political science of the University of Calcutta. Dr. Bonita Alias holds her PhD from the University of Calcutta, and she was the professor of the Department of Political Science in Calcutta University as well. She continues to be an adjunct faculty at the Women's Studies Research Center at the University of Calcutta and School of Women's Studies in Jadavpur University, engaging intensely with their teaching and research programs. She has been in teaching profession for last 36 years. She was the principal of Women's Christian College in Calcutta for a brief period. Her academic interest lies in looking at the nuisance of the Indian politics, particularly the interface between minority committees and state, highlighting the location of gender and the Dalits in this community-state interface. Some of her completed research projects and publications include Mizo Woman, Modernization and the Change, Struggles of Indian Federalism, The Punjab Problem, edited work on ethnic groups in South Asia, women in participatory democracy at Kerala, a case study of women in panchayat members, Her work on the Naga women has been much acclaimed and has been published by the Sage. Her project on Muslims in Bengal has incited considerable discourse, and innumerable articles have been published with reference to the same, such as Madrasa education, the state and community consciousness, Muslims in West Bengal, and views on Islam from the West, both in Economic and Political Weekly in Mumbai. Concepts of the nation and Muslim response in the post-Babri Masjid period was published in occasional paper, the product of UGC funding for her personal research. Other articles in this area have appeared in edited volumes. In the summer of 2012, her paper on Bengal at the Conference on Charisma after Weber, University of Birmingham, has widely appreciated and was published in the Max Weber Studies Journal. She has also published widely on Dalits. These are the products of empirical work in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and Orissa. Her empirical work on the Muslim women in Pudukkottai in Tamil Nadu explored the beneficial effects of informal justice on women in closed communities. Currently, she has intensely researched on the methodological imbroglio in social sciences. This has culminated into a volume revisiting qualitative research in the social sciences to be published by Orient Black Swan in February-March of this year. A second research chapter on the Christian and Muslim in Bengal during the Left Front regime in Bengal was due in January 2018, and now it was published. The total number of publication is about 30, including seminars and conferences. She has for been a long-time associate with the academic program of the Senate of Srirampur College as well as a member of their academic council for 3 years. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Okay,
Welcome, ma'am.
thank you. Thank you. Um, at the very outset, yes, a very good morning. It is still morning. Yes, a very good morning to all of you. And my deep appreciation at the initiative taken by the Department of Disability Studies as well as Human Rights, particularly my friend Payal, in organizing this webinar. Very few people would go into such lengths to hold such a particular seminar in West Bengal, particularly during COVID times. But you all have done it, and hats off to you all. I hope this is a continuing process. Second thing which I wish to say, Upasana was looking at a CV which is considerably old. So many things had to be updated in it. But this is my inherent laziness. I do not update my Facebook profile or Google profile. So much of the information over there should have been updated. For instance, I'm fully retired and resident in Kerala now. My association with the Women's Studies Centers in both the universities of Jadavpur and Calcutta University, yes, they are a thing of the past. I'm not in their executive bodies or I'm not associated with them anyway. However, my association continues at another level with many academic programs in Kolkata as well as elsewhere. That is mostly, I would say, in the form of written works, reviewing books, or well, such kinds of things. So yes, this reminds me I should update my CV so that people get current information. Once again, thank you, particularly Payal, for making me a part of this process. I'm very much in a laid back form in Kerala. Kerala's backwaters are very near to my current location in Tripunitura, Erur, particularly, which is a part of Ernakulam district. And so that influence kind of negates in even the desire for intense activity. It is all a kind of slow process which we can adopt. Even if we want to be very academically active, it doesn't really happen so. Yes, COVID has been very cruel for all of us here. However, my observation is that, like elsewhere, perhaps the middle class has been the least affected. And yes, the upper classes as well. So it is the downtrodden, those who sell on the streets, those who venture out to our doorways every day, they have been the most affected. This is the urban as well as the semi-urban areas. However, those who live far away from these places have been affected even more, much more than us, because their very means of livelihood in their own areas as well as their attempts to go out of their own areas for livelihood purposes has been cruelly clamped down by the administration. I'm speaking about the tribes once again, perhaps a continuity of what Debidi said just now. Mine may be a little bit of repetition, but I'm trying to focus on Kerala particularly, the tribal situation in Kerala over time. So I have titled my paper Tribals in a Bind, the historical continuity of pandemic in Kerala. Historical continuity of pandemic in Kerala, meaning that pandemic is just not 1 year's situation, but it has occurred in various forms for innumerable vulnerable communities, particularly the tribes ensconced in particular areas in the north, in the south, in the west, as well as in the eastern parts of Kerala. A few more words in the form of introduction before I launch into my paper. This pandemic has, in a way, aided self-analysis from us academics. Self-analysis that certain inevitable questions come to mind. Where are we leading, really? With these innumerable seminars, with these innumerable talks, discussions, and feeble attempts at writing, trying to focus on not only our own situation, but the situation faced by others. Where are we really leading to? Does it make any sense? Number two, not only us, but the governments also. What kind of intent do they have with the innumerable projects that they are launching out? Today's local government elections in Kerala here, in my place, it has already started since yesterday. So the campaigning, this is a reserved constituency, Erur, reserved for women. So the mainline parties and their female candidates, they have been at it very rigorously, showing the kind of enthusiasm they have for future projects. But my question is, projects for whom? Are we merely looking at us, well-fed, well-placed, have enough money at our disposal? Government has been kind, giving us a good pension to see us through, even though we may be needing medication and intense healthcare. We are able to afford it because, yes, we are well-fed and looked after properly. The candidates have been harping on these issues. Are there vociferations reaching out to those who are really vulnerable, such as the groups whom I will be focusing on, the tribals of Wayanad, northern part of Kerala? Another question, what tools really do we have at our disposal to look into these issues, to even carry forward our projects? Are these tools sufficient? Another question which comes to mind is, where does it all lead to? Who eventually benefits? Once again, it's all tied up with the question of who really are the beneficiaries of all the programs that are occurring during this year-long pandemic and perhaps in the future as well. Does it really benefit those who need the benefits the most? Or it keeps on fattening us, adding more cholesterol to our bodies, more thyroid, more diabetes, and whatnot? Is it leading us there? Who is being represented eventually? Are their needs, their requirements being projected, being focused upon? I see one of the questions posed to Devi Di is, how will the problem be eradicated? Yes, it's a very, very important question. And perhaps I'll be kind of trying to draw our attention to the need for us to be involved much more deeply, us academics, with whatever swords or tools that we have, to be involved much more deeply in the rebuilding, in the rehabilitation of the future. So my paper, as I gave you the title, it focuses on two aspects. Number one, the macro trajectory of development, as well as the efforts by the central as well as the regional government, that is Kerala, successive governments over time, through its policies, laws, and immense amount of released projects or withheld projects or whatever, to bring about some change. And as we all know, Kerala is, I would say, currently the most developed state. I have been to all parts of India, resided there, researched in many parts of India. Punjab held that priority, was topping the priority list, but I think Kerala has taken over. If you look at the statistics, yes, literacy has always been its prerogative, but if we walk down the streets of Ernakulam, which is the district where I'm staying, you will feel that you are in any of the very, very well-established districts of the southeastern part of Asia. It can be Malaysia, it can be Singapore, it can be anywhere. Kerala has developed immensely, particularly in the urban areas, its infrastructure. But even if we move inwards, in the areas which are bordering the backwaters, like where I live in, Erur, as I said, the people's affluence is mind-boggling. Devidi was talking about the Dalits. There is a large area, Kunnara, of Dalits very near to my house. But if you enter their households, you will not have the same imagery of a Dalit, which we have, say, in other parts of India, as they reflect over here. In other words, there is a marked difference between the kind of affluence, the kind of progression, the kind of stability which the Dalits have achieved in the central pockets, in various pockets of Kerala. So again, a related question arises over here. Why have the Dalits progressed? They were also demarcated as scheduled and not the tribals. Why has the same kind of observation not been possible for the tribals located in far-flung areas? Wayanad is one district which has a large majority, about 1 point something percentage of the entire 1 point something lakhs tribals are located in Wayanad, of the 3 point something lakhs of tribals all over Kerala. Then another pocket is Kollam in the south. Then there's Kozhikode, there's Kasargod. Then there are the western districts where the fisher folk live. and so on. There are these various pockets. Why cannot we see the same kind of prosperity which the Dalits have experienced? Though the Dalits would refute this statement of mine that this prosperity has not been uniform. But nevertheless, it has occurred. It is visible. They have achieved progress in education as well, and they are competing, or if not totally, but almost neck to neck with other groups here in and around my area. I would say the upper castes, the Hindus and Christians, who are, despite their religious affiliation, very much demarcated caste-wise. Let us go on to the heart of my paper. Some of it has been raised by or mentioned by Devidi already. Just to recapitulate and provide the background before I go on to Wayanad, specifically during COVID times, I need to look at the historical progression of legislation done by the central government and taken over by the state government after the state governments after the state was formed in 1956. We find that yes, I do not want to repeat the aspect that these tribals, which I'm going to focus on in Wayanad, are very differently located from the, shall we say, the protected tribals of the Northeast. Protected, I'm referring to their scheduled caste and scheduled area status given to them through Schedule 5 and 6 of the Constitution, through which, despite the excluded epithet, they could prosper. They could kind of hold on to their culture, and they were not exploited by agents, by settlers. They could have their particular laws in which settlers had to adopt to their local cultural norms, indigenize themselves in the tribal perspective, and thus they could safeguard themselves to a large extent. My 2 or 3 visits to Mizoram showed me that Gujarati shopkeepers who have set up shops in Mizoram could exist there primarily by adopting very Mizo names to camouflage their original identity, and secondly by marrying into the indigenous tribal community there. That means they must within inverted commas, must have a Mizo wife. So this kind of localization, indigenization of an outside settler into the excluded areas of the Northeast has enabled a very significant amount of prosperity to those areas, which has unfortunately eluded the tribal areas of peninsular India. Peninsular India has not had this kind of a protectionism. You may ask me why. Of course, some of it emerged from Devidi's paper. The government had a different policy towards peninsular tribals, and yes, it influenced the Kerala tribal policy as well. From immediately after independence, 1947 onwards, attempts were made to modernize, to include, to put them under corporate development, corporatist laws, etc., so that they need not cling on to forest wealth, which they were used to. Here I am particularly talking about Wayanad, a smaller district in the northern part of Kerala, which has, as I have already said, the largest amount of tribals in Kerala. So this corporatism immediately, I would say, after independence took on a different mold. Immediately after independence took on a different mold would mean that before independence, they were British-controlled corporates. which had already entered into the forest lands and violating the 1927 forest laws or policy. These companies were allowed to engage the tribals in their as wage labor to a minimalist extent. The main intention was to develop these areas in such a way that exclusive control over these by tribal chiefs or by tribal people need not linger on. Rather, it should be a diverse kind of development which would allow government to penetrate into these areas and make them a part of their holistic developmental policy, which was visible in developmental planning since a long time, but more specifically since the 1990s. So what I'm particularly trying to tell you, skipping over innumerable legislation, the details of the same, etc., is that forest dwellers, the tribals, even though initially under their own chieftains, had only notional control over their resources. They have always been in a very fragile state of livelihood. They were able to access the forest wealth, maybe do even little amounts of farming and cultivation. However, this corporatist approach and modernization, which Kerala governments have supported even before the 1990s, and the Isaac Thomas model came into being, even much before that, this kind of a, I would say, developmentalism has been visible there. So what is happening from a very long period onwards, which the 1960 Dhebar Committee found out, was that tribals have been excluded tremendously from their ownership rights, and it has to be rectified. 1975 and 1996, two significant legislations were passed by successive Kerala governments. These two legislations meant, number one, to reinstate tribal lands to tribal people. We must remember that the specific situation in Kerala was keeping in tune with what was happening in the rest of India. Successive governments were coming in the rest of India. So our democratic mind bent, our propensity to attack neoliberalism in the 90s, our propensity to push back the state and to bring about greater decentralization, all this played upon in a cumulative fashion over successive governments in Kerala to bring about a greater pro-tribal policy, because that was the community which was up in arms and which was visibly deprived of, denuded of their specific means of livelihood, which was really not collecting forest produce or depending on forest produce exclusively, but farming. The entry of the settlers, corporatism, etc., had somehow influenced the tribals to go in for settled agricultural profession as well. The little lands that they had, and through certain pro-tribal legislations passed off and on by the respective governments, enabled them to hold on to these farmlands. Things come to a head in 1999, just last year. The tribals, they had done two morchas or road marches to Thiruvananthapuram, the capital. The intention was to park before the state secretariat and demand their rights. They wanted restitution of their lands, which far back in 1960s had been advocated by a very strong legislation by the central government that they have to be reinstituted. Whatever has been taken away from them has to be given back to them. Yes, there was a rider in those legislations, which the state government, despite its, I would say, pro-tribal policy, projected frequently, could not do away with. Question of the settlers, the non-tribal settlers coming in from the mainland of Kerala. We do not have any particular survey showing that whether any non-Malayalis have also made an entry into these tribal demarcated areas. I do not have data for that. But definitely from the mainland of Kerala, the heart of Kerala, settlers entered into these tribal areas. So the rider was in the legislations done by the governments, Kerala government as such. This non-tribal settler could not be deprived of his or her status. They were landowners, and if any transfer of land had to be done to the tribal, it had to be done under two conditions. Number one, the Tribal Advisory Council, under the advice of the local panchayat, the Gram Sabhas, it could done with their help, transfer of land. However, an equal amount of money had to be paid by the tribal to compensate whatever rectification, whatever modernization, whatever repair had been done by the government. Where does the tribal get that money? And they could get back only if their original possession was more than 2 hectares of land. All this was very confusing. All this was very, very, I would say, mind-boggling. And last but not the least, it was pushing the tribal back into the money lenders' clutches. They would have to borrow that money in order to pay the government in order to get back their land. Now, how does one do all this? While this is going on, this kind of confusing state is going on, and they have done their 2 morchas. The Adhigastra, these Malayalam terms are still a bit difficult for me. It was the Adhiga struggle and the Aripa struggle. Adhiga is a tribal community. The Aripa struggle, and the second one I'm referring to is the Thovarimala struggle. These two were intended to be very forceful ones, where they were reiterating laws which had been already passed in their favor in the 60s itself, saying that there should be a restitution of land ownership to the tribals. Then we have the pandemic. Since the end of last year, visible effects of the same are being felt. It comes as a sudden shock. It comes as a sudden, I would say, break on all their plans at progression. What are the various facts and aspects of the same? I will not be repeating, because we are all conversant with the newspapers, the social media, all that has been the problems of specific vulnerable groups, of marginalized communities has been focused upon very clearly in the media. My source of references, I had a very, very short time to kind of put this thing together. So my source of references were, number one, the mainstream media, which I get online. They are guarded in their approach. Obviously, they have to be aware of their licenses. They cannot be too critical, the mainstream media. But what has been really an eye-opener are the smaller, invisible Malayali, origin in Malayalam, newspapers, small-time journals, And thirdly, much more influential has been the video recordings of journalists, stroke activists who have been working in the Wayanad forests. Today, nobody can enter the Wayanad forests. A professor who was giving me much references and contacting me from there, from a college in Wayanad, he told me, "Madam, please don't attempt to come here for a field work, however short it may be. You will be shot at. Or, well, even before that, the government won't allow your jeep to enter it." So the point is the media, the small term media, which is mostly in the local languages, and the journalist reports, the activists' analysis and facts, etc., they have been immensely helpful, and we can find them. I have some associates who have been very helpful in providing all this material to me. A summary of all these documents. I do not know if I'm overstepping my time. I should have ended by now. The organizers, can you please help me? It's 11:56 according to my time. Should I end up or can I go on for some more time? Well, there is no response, so I think I can continue.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
The small term media, they have shown particularly that the education of the tribal children has been particularly affected. There was a law called Gotra Vandi. Gotra Vandi meaning maybe it could have been a bullock cart or a very rough kind of a two-wheeler or perhaps even a four-wheeler meant for the tribal children, particularly the high school girls who had to travel far
Ma'am?
from the deep forest. Yes? Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Ma'am, you have 10 more minutes.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, Upasana. So the Gotra Vandi Act had been passed by one of the governments. Successively, all have been very favorable towards the tribals. So it has been passed already. Supposedly meant to carry the tribal girls intending higher education to their respective schools. But the Vandi has never been visible. The activists, the journalists, and even the small-time media, they have all been very vociferous about this, that the girls, the boys, all their education seems to have come to a standstill. Number two, Kerala government has been very, very particular about giving even television sets to particular areas where poverty level, below poverty level students study, right? However, in this Wayanad cases, the main problem is they do not have any Wi-Fi, they do not have any electricity, they do not have proper mobiles. Even if they do, if the mobile needs repair, there is nothing or no one to give them any advice as to how it can be rectified. Laptops are definitely not there. However, recently what I heard was a Panchayat Bhavan has been set aside in particular areas in Wayanad tribal areas where the children can gather at particular points of time for their classes, online classes. All classes are online, like in the rest of India, here in Kerala as well. But the moment they gather there, the electricity is definitely not available, so they just return back home, which is a long and arduous journey. They don't have any vehicular help. Higher education, see, about 20 years ago, it could be just somehow class 12. And then they take up small-time jobs, either in the urban areas or they stay back home, particularly the women, and help out in whatever way they can. But today, they are aspirants to MBBS for engineering and so on. During pandemic, all this has come to a stop. The aspirations, in the sense, they cannot access their training centers. Even if they had started getting some training for UPSC examinations, state level governmental examinations, competitive and so on, they cannot go Number one, the government doesn't allow them to leave their residences and go out. If they are living at the fringes of the forest, most of them are, the police sees to it that they cannot come out. They are completely under lockdown, even though we are able to access malls and marketplaces and so on and so forth. Right now, I can take my vehicle and go, or I can hire a vehicle and go, but that's not so for the vehicles. Government does not provide them with anything. So that is so for training, which is highly desirable by the tribal young boys and girls. They want to go on in life, get on in life, but it is not possible. Simply not possible. On the other hand, the mainstream media is projecting that such and such training centers for MBBS has been set up. Even for UPSC examinations, there are no takers for it. So there is contradiction in the reports given by the activists in the field and the large-scale media. Secondly, health, nutrition, food, the problem of pregnant women, small children. Nutritious food, they could somehow manage due to their inherent indigenous knowledge of the same by foraging from the forest and supplementing their agriculturists' diet. No longer so, since once again their mobility is severely restricted. Not so for others, not so for non-tribal population. So these seem to be much more untouchable than, I would say, the previous or the archaic idea of untouchability. The reports claim that each family can have as many as 13 to 15 members. A minimum would be 13, a maximum would be 15. The 35 kg of rice, sometimes in certain areas it is 25 kg of rice, in other areas it is 35 kg of rice. This is definitely not sufficient for one family for a month. Rice is their staple food and they do not have anything else to supplement that. There is no longer a recourse to honey or any other kind of nutritious leaves from the forest. But if that rice is not there, how do you feed the children? How do you feed the pregnant wife? How do you feed the person who is desiring work and wanting to go out? So this is health, nutrition, etc. Pregnancy, of course, this problem has been faced by, say, villagers elsewhere as well. Lack of transportation. So deliveries are very hazardous, maybe on the road itself. They cannot even leave their colonies as such. There are more than 8,000 Kerala where these people are congested together, put in as cattle. They cannot move out of them. And there is no means of communication. Now, these would be some of the main things pointed out by the journalists as well as the activists in the area. Their demands are many, and they have even posted in Facebook a list of their demands. This was 4th of April this year, 2020, where a list of demands by the tribal groups have been posted on Facebook, showing that they need these kind of rectifications as soon as possible. They want to become a part of the Janani Janam Raksha Paddhati, which gives much freedom to them, which gives them much kind of support at the time of need. So this is their major demand immediately would be proper connectivity to allow their children to catch up with the school syllabi, which is progressing fast. They're almost nearing their annual examinations, but these tribal children have not got any kind of training to cover the this particular year's syllabus. So their major demand, as I see in the list that has been provided, is this. Now, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that these pandemic-specific problems are not isolated. They have a continuity over time. Kerala has experienced two immense amounts of flooding over time, and these floods have already made the vulnerable groups even more vulnerable. There were immense landslides, their houses, whatever they could build, or even with government help, were washed away. I have the names of these places showing that they have been affected very much. Two other problems they indicate. Number one, elephant menace. Surprisingly, only tribals, if they try to erect some kind of a wired fence around their house, are immediately chastised, but not the settlers. Settlers can protect their farmlands with the help of electrical wires to prevent the elephant menace from marauding their farmlands. But yes, the police is very, very choosy in whom to chastise and take into custody when it comes to real life. And elephant menace, and secondly, it is the left-wing terrorism. So Maoists, ex-Naxals who have all been converted into Maoists, they find the tribals to be a very, very, I would say, appropriate audience to teach their own literature, to get across their own literature to them, left-wing literature, and secondly, to highlight the problems of the government as well. The government's negligent approach, the government's non-developmentalism, in the name of development exclusivism, and even further pushing them back in the cycle of real modern development. So I think I should conclude now. My main submission has been to highlight the extreme divisions in governmental approach in its developmental policy. It has simply no idea of inclusivism, but development in 20th century, 21st century, as advocated by innumerable theoreticians, innumerable practical studies, does not mean that. It means including everybody within your fold. No attempt whatsoever has been done so far. If any attempt has been made, it may be by religious groups to penetrate into these areas. However, those results have not been very, very laudable as such. There is intense criticism here as in elsewhere. Southern Kerala has seen agitations to the penetration of religious groups in trying to modernize, include them, give them some succor. So they are left in the lurch. They are left in the lurch, excluded from mainstream communities, nobody to stand by them. In such an atmosphere, the left-wing terrorism has gained immense foothold. And why not? This has happened elsewhere. There's a paper on Chhattisgarh, I think, and one from Nagaland as well. I'm sure these things will be highlighted. I come back to my original question, which I had posed during the introduction of my lecture. And that is, who is being represented by the innumerable elected representatives that we are sending up to the local government, to the state assembly, even to the central assembly? Who is being represented with what intent? Who benefits? Who are the ultimate beneficiaries? Are we not aware of the problems of these people? We, the educated class who hold immense seminars, who do a lot of writings, I would appeal to all you people who are out there listening to my lecture, take up your pens, write about the negligence of repeated governments at denying these, our brothers and sisters, the tribals lodged in the far-flung areas, who have no idea of what benefits are there for them, who have been deprived by us, penetrating into their lands, buying very cheaply, by bribing the bureaucrat, buying those immense estates and setting up our own industry. we grow and are fattened and fall sick. But these people, yes, they also fall sick, but not due to the same reasons. Thank you, Upasana, and thank you all for patiently hearing me out. Yes, my speech might have had
Thank
innumerable
you, ma'am.
agenda. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am, for edifying us on the issue which has been a major concern for quite a long time now. It was surely a thought-provoking and something to work upon. Ma'am, we have now questions for you and ma'am, and I would like to ask questions now. The first question is for Devi ma'am, that after independence, we are in 75 years to go now, and till now, reservation policy is going on. And in some cases, SC and ST families, all the members do government jobs, and in other hand, rest of the people are in backward. What is the way to overcome this situation? This question is from Ganesh Bag.
Upasana, may I request you to look through all the questions? There's a link so far as all the questions go. I mean, I would like to take up all the questions together.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Right.
The next question is by Amitabh Banik, who asked, as the tribal population is highly vulnerable and also isolates, what are the initiatives to reach welfare aspect, such as education and healthcare to them? How effective is the NGO model for the same? The next question we got for Professor Bonita Alias is by Liton Mitro, who asked, ma'am, please discuss about Act of 1986 for tribal people. Again,
No, just a minute. Just a minute. My questions, I have these two questions only.
no, ma'am, you have more questions also.
Okay, give me my questions and then Professor Elias will take up her questions.
Sure, ma'am. We have a question that is by Debashish Kumar Dotto, that is, on every annual budget, various grants are announced for the tribes. How far do these reach for them? Can't be there any permanent solution to give them standard livelihood? What may be those? The next question is, there are many laws regarding tribals and their other vulnerable groups, but the appliances are less like to be seen when it comes to the tribal issue. What are the reasons for giving them this attention, the less attention, and how it will be eradicated? Ma'am, only these.
Yes, I requested you to give me all the questions together because somewhere I find all the questions are linked together. They are very similar questions. I mean, one, we are looking at the question that despite reservation and other facilities, as mentioned in the other questions, they do not reach out to the tribes, or the tribes do not gain as they should be gaining. What is the solution, basically, and about the NGO model? I would mention in this context that, of course, marginally the benefits have reached and do reach. I wouldn't say that the benefits don't reach at all. But we can say it is too little, too late coming in. That's one. I will also point out here something that I mentioned in the course of my presentation, that we need to go to basics. We need to look at the development model as such. Otherwise, when we are focusing only on, let us say, education, health, yes, we can have some solutions to the problems on a temporary basis, The NGOs can help there. I'm not saying that nothing can be achieved, but those would be like symptomatic treatments to a more deep-rooted ailment. If you are treating a cancer patient, let us say, with symptomatic treatments, rather than looking at the core area of the ailment, it does not solve the problem. In fact, the problem becomes more acute in course of time. So here also, unless you look at the development model, which is not appropriate, and tends to lead to the exclusion of the tribal population amongst others, what we can achieve, or what we have achieved so far, and what we can achieve would be a continuation of that, would be certain symptomatic treatments of the problem. And NGOs, of course, could help to that extent, but they could not go beyond that initial symptomatic handling. And reaching out the advantages to the tribal population of what there is in the government grants or budgets, etc. Those who are worst off in any society are also those who are the most distant from the corridors of power. So if they do not get what is allotted to them, they cannot make their voices heard. And there are others to skim off the advantages, to take it away from them and see that it doesn't reach them. So I think it is ultimately the basics that have to be addressed. And finally, in this context, I would say, when you are looking at the pandemic and the worsening of the tribal's condition in this regard, we have to remember that they do not have any capital. When I say capital, I don't just mean financial capital. Health, education, finance, everything. They do not have the capital so that they can swim through this crisis. As a result, they get much worse hit than the relatively better off sections of society. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Now we have question for Professor Bonita Alias. Ma'am.
Yes, you can continue.
Yes, ma'am. The first question is, please discuss about the Act of 1986 for the tribal people. The next question is, what are a few pragmatic pedagogical solutions for the governmental policy prescriptions ensuring upward mobility for the tribal children? The next question is by Rituparna Nath. Can this developmental concern be called a colonial impact in disguise? The next question is again by her, that is, how can disparity between the upper class and the tribals be reconciled, although keep in together sovereignty intact?
Okay, my camera doesn't seem to be working now. So you can hear me, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am. We
All
can
right,
hear you.
fine. So let me start from the end. Rituparna has two questions. She's calling the developmentalism colonialism in disguise. And she's also asking about any pragmatic pedagogical solutions to the same. Right. So these two questions, I would say, are somehow linked together. So far, our textbooks do not include chapters for specifically highlighting the problems and needs of people having specific kind of requirements, such as the tribals. We do not have chapters or subjects exclusively for them. Say, just as a hypothetical issue, I would say, we do not have anything called archery classes for tribal students. We do not have any syllabi appreciating their abilities to do craft work or even to work with soil, artisanship, etc. So far as pragmatic pedagogical approach is concerned, we should be very, very, very much location centric. Central government is more interested in homogenization of syllabi, is more interested in uniformity of the examination pattern, thinking that everybody can fall under one, they can be put into one basket and developmentalism will ensure. But this has been the bane, this has been very much antagonistic to the approach that is really required. Maybe for the next 100 years or so, we need to have differentiated policy for tribals, for scheduled castes, for various linguistic groups, etc. We cannot be put under one linguistic policy or one developmental policy. That is just out of the question. So therefore, it is a kind of colonialism once again. So far as the first question is concerned, Discuss Act of 1986. See, 1975, an approach was made by Achyuta Menon to primarily bring about fragmentation of lands for decentralization and return of land to the tribals. However, for the next 10 years or so, nothing progressed. It was only around 86 onwards that committees were set up to distribute land, to bring this into effect. But, and this I have already stated in my paper, it had immense amount of riders. The land had to be particularly in the name of the tribals. It had to be registered. They had to show their ownership, which I know has happened in Orissa as well, where the POSCO problem arose, and the POSCO industry was trying to oust the tribals. But when their agitation started, they had to prove, they had to show pramans that they have been there for the last 75 years. Then they could be proper claimants of the soil. Similarly, something like this was also attempted post 1986, and the Tribal Advisory Committee or Council, which was set up, was clearly not in a position to take drastic decisions in this regard. Then I have already talked about the monetary issue linked to the same, that the tribal had to pay some amount of money equivalent to the land which he could have received or he was about to receive. This would in reality push him further and further into debt. So practically the 1975, 1986, the 1999, none of these regulations have been pro-tribal. That's it. Yes? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
You are
I'm
audible.
done.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm done. You can.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Now, I would like to request Pubali Bhattacharya, the student of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development, to kindly provide a vote of thanks. Pubali, up to you.
We are very thankful for both of our eminent lecturers today, Professor Devi Chatterjee, Professor of International Relations, retired, and to Professor Bonita Alias, Professor of Political Science, retired, University of Calcutta. It was a privilege to come across the wealth of knowledge that they provided us. Racial minorities and tribal people being a subject of violation and vulnerabilities which are not much talked about. We are grateful that you joined us and enlightened us with your knowledge, both practical and educational. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we are moving forward to the technical session, and I would now like to request Professor Devi Chatterjee, ma'am, to begin today's session as the chairperson. Ma'am, we have three paper presenters, and I would like to call the first paper presenter, that is Mr. Shomudit Nyogi from the University of Delhi. He's a senior research fellow, and the title of his paper is Hegemony and Resilience, that is Poetics of Naga Tribal Life in Temsulao's short stories. Up to you, sir.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So this paper that I'm about to present, it
15 minutes.
basically, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'll try my best to complete it within 15 minutes, ma'am. So this paper it relates to how Temsulao presents the condition of Naga tribals vis-a-vis the conditions that they faced when the Naga insurgency was on. So what these texts, she wrote a lot of short stories, and what we learn from her short stories is different cultural aspects of the Naga people and how they tried to cope with the Naga insurgency and the problems of militancy that was ongoing in Nagaland. So I'll begin. The ethnocultural ethos of India's northeast is completely diverse from the rest of India. The northeastern states have over 150 different tribes who practice different faiths, beliefs, rituals, traditions, customs, and speak in several different languages. The region comprises the 8 states of Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, and Tripura, and it is celebrated for its natural beauty and virgin landscapes. Northeast India is different from the rest of India in several ways, and the people there have resisted the forceful assimilation into Indian mainstream national discourse for several decades. Now, I'll explain this a bit. What happened after partition and after India's independence was that the entire northeastern region was used to be under the state of Assam. After partition and after independence, Assam was eventually carved out to make these other states, these northeastern states. So the process by which that happened was extremely violent, and it took a lot of bloodshed to get that. Now, non-conformity with assumed practices of Indianness forced successive central governments to push the region to the fringes, leading to political marginalization of the people who inhabit that space. Northeastern people feared that their history and unique cultural identities would be subsumed under hegemonic nationalist discourses, and the region's inherent heterogeneous ethos would be forcibly homogenized by the Indian government. However, the Indian state has always in the past regarded that region as a land of unsophisticated tribal people who require standardization, rectification, and modernization in their way of life. In this regard, I'd like to point out that the term tribal, which we use, which is officially also used to refer to the locals of the region, is problematic because it equates them with primitivism. B.B. Kumar, who asserts that the Indian state authorities were unable to incorporate the regional histories in the broader framework of Indian history, to the extent that the region got categorized even as being non-Indian. Now, in this context, literature has this innate connection with society, cultural ethos, and history of a place, and thus it can reflect its ultimate essence. The literature of India's Northeast can help us understand the intricate nuances of the region's delicate issues. It is reflective of tribal sentiments and can voice historically suppressed truths and self represent their concerns. It also helps us learn about the exploitation and marginalization that these people suffered, and it also helps them to assert their own identities. Northeastern authors like Mamang Dei from Arunachal Pradesh, Piyush Rawat from Tripura, Sheri Shangte from Mizoram, Anupama Basumatar from Assam, and Ao Temsulao from Nagaland portray the unique cultures that their individual areas, regions have, and they subvert the homogenizing identities that have been imposed upon them by the Indian state. These authors depict the emotions of fear and hope, which is engendered by the people uh, during the periods of violence that they had suffered. So I'll move on to now Temsulao specifically. Temsulao is one of northeastern India's most acclaimed authors. She is a Padma Shri awardee and she also received the Sahitya Academy Award. She primarily writes short stories and poems, and her works reflect the different cultural practices and traditions of not only her own tribe, the Ao tribe, but also of most Naga tribes and Naga tribes in general. So when we read Temsulao, we can be familiarized with the diverse cultural ethos of the land and basically become more aware of that region. Her stories reveal tribal affliction and the loss of cultural traditions and the erosion of their history, along with an intense longing to recover their heritage. I'll explain this. What happens is with modern globalization, these tribal communities are afraid of losing out their own cultural heritage, their own traditional practices, as the youngsters tend to leave most of these practices. So, what Ao does through her works is display a nostalgic yearning for these practices. She does what I can say a cultural revivalism and a return to the tribal way of life by preserving the memories of ordinary village lives. In this paper, I'll briefly describe four short stories of Ao. Two of the short stories describe how the how the Naga tribes face trouble from the Indian forces, and two of the short stories will reflect how they faced problems from their own Naga militants. The story of Temsula Ao, she described the story of the Naga people as a story of history's accidents, of an arbitrary line drawn across culturally contiguous lands, dismembering the natural and inevitable growth and movement of a community, a consequence of colonial ambitions. What this means is after independence, when Assam was carved into several other northeastern states, what happened was that these divisions did not take place according to linguistic boundaries like it happened with the rest of India. In Northeast, it was more haphazard, and as a result, what happened? Different tribal communities got clubbed into one state, and tribal communities and people belonging to the same tribe got divided into different states. And this problem has been continuous and it has been affecting the Northeast till today. We will highlight these differences and these problems in the four short stories now. Ao highlights the grievances of the tribal people in her short stories From These Hills Called Home. For instance, in the story An Old Man Remembers, she depicts how a grandfather informs his grandson of the specific circumstances that they had to endure, which forced them to become rebels and join the Naga insurgency in their youth. The grandfather, Sashi, is initially taken aback and struggles to answer his grandson when he innocently inquires him whether he had killed several people during his younger days. Sashi explains that he and his best friend were simple school-going children at that time, leading ordinary lives when the sudden offensive by the Indian forces changed their lives completely. He is unable to repress this traumatic phase of his life, and the unexpected question triggers back all the memories that he had suppressed. However, on further introspection, he realizes that his entire generation had become involved in an endless cycle of beatings, rapes, burning of villages, forced labors, groupings of villages, and running from one hideout to another. Their whole youth was spent in trying to escape the Indian soldiers as youngsters, and they could do nothing but join the rebel ranks to fight the Indian state. And in the process, they became ruthless killers. Yet he feels that survivors like himself owed it to everyone to inform them about those days of violence and how dangerous were those hills that they called home. Ao justifies her argument for preserving tribal memories through the character of the grandfather called Sashi, who feels that older people should not keep the youngsters unaware of the price that they had to pay in order to secure their own separate state of Nagaland. He informs the grandfather, that is, informs that the marauding Indian army had burned their villages and were in pursuit of the younger Nagas, who were forced to hide inside jungles to ensure their survival. He highlights that living with the constant threats to their lives made them acquire a new sense of cunning, and they had to participate in ambushes which involved killing Indian security personnel. Thus, Sashi informs his grandson of the specific circumstances which had forced them to become the ruthless killers when he was only 16. The psychological impact of this violence can be persistent, as Ao shows in the character of Sashi, who informs that despite laying down their weapons to start regular lives, several rebel Nagas had intense traumatic relapses, and some even contemplated if they were becoming monsters, if they had become transformed into monsters. Sashi realizes after sharing these long suppressed memories that once in a lifetime one ought to face the truth about the self, the land, and above all, the truth about their history. And it was for the youngsters to learn from this history to build a better future. So in this story, what we learn is how simple ordinary Naga people, simple youngsters, were forced to pick up the gun because what they perceived as the Indian state were trying to homogenize or trying to destroy their culture. In another short story called The Last Song, Temsulao articulates the importance of the intergenerational transmission of truth about history, or the intergenerational transmission of this information about their own history. In the story, The Last Song, the narrative is set in a secluded Naga village where an old storyteller narrates to a group of young listeners the events of Black Sunday, when Indian forces had burned down a dissenting Naga village and shot innocent villagers and desecrated their church after raping and killing a young choir girl. This little girl called Apenyo was the only child of her mother. She loved singing and her talent was acknowledged by all the villagers, which made her mother proud. It had been decided that she would sing in the choir when the new village church would be opened. But the narrative reveals that the Indian forces were making a sinister plan to teach these dissenting tribals a lesson. And I quote from the narrative: it was decided that the army would go to that particular village on a particular day when they were dedicating the new church building and arrest all the leaders for their crime of paying taxes to the underground forces. On the day of the church opening, the Indian forces raided the village and fired upon the unarmed villagers, who were shocked that the army would desecrate their holy day. The new church was burned down, and when people tried to take shelter inside its premises to escape the firing outside, they were also killed. However, the little girl refused to flee and she continued her singing, unaware of everything that was happening around her. The security forces regarded this action as an insult and a serious affront by a mere tribal girl, and they killed her after gang raping her. Her mother made the same fate when she tried to save her. Their bodies were left inside the church and were subsequently burned during the arson attack. Now the old storyteller informs her listeners that the villager still remembers and honors that little girl who died protesting against the Indian forces and thus saved several people from dying. Now, what we learn from these stories is obviously there was a huge discord between the people supporting the Naga insurgents and the Indian forces. The Indian forces uh, used to look upon everyone supporting the Naga insurgency, even if they were non-combatant civilians, as enemies because they were supplying them with food and providing them shelter. So even if people were not actually involved in the insurgency, physically killing other people and physically as militants, but they were still supporting. So they deserved what the Indian forces felt where they deserved to be punished. Now, the Naga people were not only oppressed by the Indian forces, but also their own community members who had started to collude with the Indian state. In addition to this, there was inter-tribal and inter-ethnic rivalries, and these were severe and these would often lead to violent clashes. There were local power structures which were weak from the very inception of the state, and expanding on these issues of tribal rivalries, we can see that despite having several internal differences, tribal militant groups were generally unified in their demand for greater sovereignty and autonomous homelands. However, internecine violence, which is violence between different tribal groups and militants, took place due to factional fighting and disputes with regarding to taxation. These problems are also highlighted by our inner stories and how underground rebels would often extort money, rations, and livestock from villagers and threaten them with dire consequences if they did not comply. The Indian forces, and if the Indian forces were to learn about this exchange that people were helping the Nagas, obviously, as we just saw, they would designate the villagers as hostile and burn down their entire village. The villagers were unfortunately caught in the middle of the war between the army and the militants. In her story Shadows, Ao narrates how it was mandatory to have a balanced tribal representation also within the militant groups in order to ensure that different tribal concerns were addressed. In the story, we see the militants from different groups are going to China to train to become proper militants and train their respective tribal brethren. The narrative stresses on intertribal rivalries through the character of Koito, the leader of a Naga militant group who executes the brutal murder of another Naga comrade, simply because he hated him and he did not think that he deserved to become a militant in their group. He believes that this person only got a chance to be.
You have 2 more.
Yes, ma'am. Only got a chance because he was the son of another militant leader. In another short story, The Letter, she discusses how ordinary villages had to kill Naga militants themselves because they felt that these militants were unjustly oppressing and taking their own village produce. I'll skip this story and I'll go directly to the conclusion then. From Temsula Ao's narrativization of Nagaland, we can see the different ordeals that the tribal communities faced and the marginalization that they had endured from India since India's independence. The narratives show the human sides of the insurgency and the resilience that the people had to show and had to live with in the face of oppressive hegemonic forces. These hegemonic forces were both the Indian state and the Naga militants. She highlights how violence was a constant part of their lives and she lays bare the perceptions of traumatic experiences of the people who lived in this terror. In highlighting these collective emotions of hope and resilience, what we see our doing is transcend from not only portraying the conditions of our own tribe and the people of Nagaland, but also show the global experience of mankind. And through this, she acquires an aesthetic universality because she depicts the universal experience of man to overcome the forces of oppression. Thank you. I hope I managed in time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neogi. You have managed within your time limit, and you have made a very interesting presentation about the Naga tribes, about their emotions and their realities, and their conflict situation with forces, as have been depicted in the short stories. Thank you very much. Let's now move on to the next presentation. If there are any questions, they would be asked finally, or any discussions that would all depend on the time. The next presentation is by Victoria Muller, and she would be introduced by Upasana. Please.
We have the next paper presentation from Ms. Maria Victoria Muller-Terran. She is a postgraduate student at the Department of Human Rights and Human Development of Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. She is from Argentina, and the title of her paper is Participating in the Decision-Making Process as a Way to Stop Racial Discrimination.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity of having us here in this international webinar of 7 days. It's very important to talk about the vulnerable groups and the human rights. So in this occasion, I'm going to talk about the inclusion in the decision-making process as a way to stop racial discrimination. As we know, the racial discrimination has been for years in our world, from the colonization to the slave trade, to the slavery, to the different Holocaust genocides that we have. And Also, sorry. The aim of the paper is to show the daily racial discrimination that people is suffering nowadays, that it continues in our world. The racial discrimination is not something from the past. It was not only the apartheid, it was not only the Holocaust. It's still here and very alive, and we need to stop it and prevent it for continuing it. So one of the aims is to highlight that, to generate awareness and consciousness among people and among the viewers, and also to talk about one that can be a solution, like is the inclusion in the decision-making process as a way to stop racial discrimination. I want to highlight my mental process while preparing this paper. In the beginning, it was going only to be focused in the inclusion in the decision-making process with the theoretical part, as I'm a social worker. But then I realized that indeed that was not inclusive at all and was going to be incomplete and non-substantial in nature. So I decided to interview for people with who I'm very grateful and I'm very honored to interview them and ask them for their points of views, their experience, and their feelings. So I want to thank them especially to Michael from Cameroon, Selma from Ghana, Edwidge from Ivory Coast, and SS from Ghana also. They help me, they teach me, and they let me deconstruct myself in this process. That is a long path to stop with the discrimination. So moving to the next slide, Upasana, please. If you can share it from the presentation, you go to view and you show it. Okay, you can share it or no, if not.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the brief legal history.
The screen is visible, right?
Let me check. No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
Here it is. So the brief legal history, as I was telling before, we start with the colonization with the slave. Upasana, please mute your mic. In 1926, we have the Slavery Convention, the International Convention from the UN. And in 1948, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are going to be two important international agreements and conventions and declarations that would have the objective of stop with this racial discrimination and talk that we are all human beings equal on rights, freedom, and dignity. But what happened while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was made and came into being? We have the Holocaust between 1933 and 1945. We have the apartheid in South Africa and Namibia between 1947 and 1992, which finally the UN declared a crime against humanity in 1973. After this, we have in 1969 the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. But even with the UDHR and all these declarations, we will have the Rwanda genocide and the Bosnian genocide, in which the international community didn't participate and involve themselves properly, while knowing that this was going to happen. So moving to this, we can see that this is not something from one day to another, the racial discrimination. It comes from the background. We have a historical background from where we need to learn to don't repeat anymore what we are repeating actually. We still being discriminative in some countries with our words, with our policies at work, in educational institutes. All discrimination generates inequality, poverty, low self-esteem, anger, deaths, injustice, violation of rights, dignity, and freedom. And we really need to stop it. So going to the interviews, and as I really need to address their opinions, I'm going to read the questions that I made them and some of the answers, since I need to show their own answers. I can't speak for them. It's my responsibility to show what exactly they have said and how they feel. So I request to all the listeners to leave aside the phone and listen properly and try to emphasize with the people that is speaking, because they're human beings just like me and you, with only a different skin color, and they are suffering so much just because of that, because humans feel that they are better than them, with no reason to feel that. So the first question is, what is the daily racial discrimination that people with dark skin colors suffer? So one of the interviews said, in my country, I don't face racism because I am one of them. I'm just a human being. But here in India, when I step outside, everyone says, look, there is a black girl. And in China, they took video of us without our consent, wherever you go in the bus, subway. But why they make a video of me? I don't want my video. I don't know where, but I can't stop them. I feel uncomfortable with the videos, the staring. And another interview say, people see at you and start laughing. Please, viewers, listen at these words. The second question was more focused on the role of the social media, role of the media, the international media. What are they doing? So I ask, are there any atrocities occurring right now that are not being shown in international media or not receiving proper help from the international community? And they all say, yes. Actually, right now in Cameroon, Nigeria, Congo, Zimbabwe, Liberia, Ivory Coast, civil wars are happening, violation of human rights from the government, killing people, protesters, the police using the force. Have we seen that in international media? Not me. I only get to know because of Instagram, because of people from that countries are posting it. If not, I wouldn't get to know. So one of the interviews says, there is a civil war happening in Cameroon. Recently, in one city of the Anglophone region, that there are rebel groups that said if you want to continue running the school, you shouldn't put the national flag of Cameroon. The 24th of this month, in October, one of the rebels group told the principal to pay them money for the protection of the school. And what the rebel did after he refused was to go to the classroom and shoot all the students and left. And this is not in the international media. This is a problem that has been happening for 4 years. I'm asking you, you didn't know that this happened? This can't happen in the year 2020. In the last 4 years, in the last 6 years, how this continue happening and how the international media is not showing this. They have a responsibility with everyone. Another question was, do you have any personal experience suffering the racial discrimination? What are the common things that you suffer in other countries or in your own country? So 2 answers were, when I got here in India in 2016, they wouldn't rent me the house because I am African people, I am not vegan. Only because from where you come, they don't rent you a house. In my job, for example, when it's the decision process that automatically I'm excluded. It's a decision that involves everyone in the office, but they just assume and they don't involve me. I don't say anything because sometimes I think it's better to overlook things because it's part of people. This is who they are. I didn't came to change them or to put effort in something that is stupid, sorry for the word. So it will be a waste of time. So I let it go. So this is fair. This is just to people suffer this. Are we aware that this is continue happening? So now I request you to listen carefully. What are your feelings when you experience these situations or know that someone suffered it? I feel angry. Then I think about it and I feel so sad. Why you think this is about me? Why you do this to me? Why you do this to me? It feels really bad. I can't lie. I feel bad. Imagine you have a mindset going to a place or for a service and they deny it based on your skin color. It hurts, you know. I haven't got to that point. It might get you to the point when you start questioning yourself. I am different. Why we are letting people feel like this? Why we are still not doing anything? Why we hear people saying racist comments, attitudes, and we are not telling them to stop it? Maybe we are not doing it, but maybe my neighbor is doing it. Why we are not taking action for this? So, as the inclusion decision-making process, it's very important to highlight all this. As we can see, if I wouldn't ask them all this to them, I wouldn't know the realities that they sit down in a bus in China and the woman move out from there because they didn't want to sit with them just because of the skin color. I didn't live that. They live it. So now I'm trying to represent them with all my efforts and with all my respect. And I hope that all of you are listening carefully to this and we are getting conscious with this paper. There are two international documents right now that talk about the inclusion in the decision-making process, not only maybe in politics, it can be also in the media, it can be in the development when you go to a country to help to develop or to make policies of development. We need them there because they are the ones that know the culture. They are the ones that suffer the discrimination. They are the ones that know how to address the issue. So we will have the Durban Declaration and Program of Action that combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And right now, we are living in the International Decade for People of African Descent by the UN General Assembly. So from the years 2015 to 2024, we are in this international decade where efforts have to be made for the dialogue, equal opportunities, especially in development, focusing the role of the media, stop with the illiteracy, better access to justice, adopt participative and inclusive measures to equal participation in public and political affairs, including the development in the decision-making process, and everything with a gender perspective, knowing that women are the ones that suffer more. So in this session, with my ideas and what I get to know because of them, I asked them different questions about the decision-making process. If they would like to participate in a meeting, for example, with the social sector, educational institution, politicians, health system, private sector, and address the issue. Teach them how to be more inclusive, how to have the diversity without discrimination. So they all say that yes, that they would love that. They would love to participate, educate people, especially in the school. We need to start from school. So to make the school less discriminative and include in the programs the diversity and the history, the real history, they need to be part of the decision making of how to produce that program. And he also asked them if I'm from an international community and I want to go to their country to create a program or to work for them to social aid project, how will be good, like respecting. So they say about sensibilization, first with the community, talk with the representatives of the community, inform yourself how things are done, and go to the different institutions, ask for them what they need, what they want, how they want it. Because you can't come from a different country and impose your idea. You need the people from the community to teach you how to do it in their own ways. You have to connect both ideas, both knowledge, and to make an inclusive project. So, going to the conclusion, as we can see, the right to non-discrimination is not simply the subject of comments or exclusion in an educational space. It is something integral and that goes from little investment in development of a community, discrimination in the workplace, in education or in the street, and in the lack of opportunities. It is the daily discrimination with unpaid work or in bad conditions with comments and looks, with the lack of real access to justice and a fair trial. It's in the looks, in the thoughts, in the stigmatizing of every day. Participation in the decision-making process is a real and inclusive way to stop racial discrimination. As the respondents agree, their participation is fundamental and the space to raise their voices. Everyone that is listening today has the duty to contribute to prevent racial discriminatory acts as well as to address and stop the existing ones. In all spheres, it is necessary to include the voice of the ones who suffer from it, empower it, and respect it. We must stop with the supremacy and the thought that we can know everything and start listening to others and following advices. It's a long journey to stop the racial discrimination, since in the end it's deeply in the minds and some cultures, but slowly we are moving forward and achieving different goals. We must do it as a whole community, respecting each other and educating ourselves, educating since childhood with a sense of brotherhood and creating awareness among the daily people we see as well as in every case we can. And with this I conclude. I wanted to know their opinion of participating in this paper. So I asked them how they feel with this paper. So they say that it's a good start because at the end of the day, they say that two heads are better than one. If you decide to sit in your room and assume that this is how people feel, this is how discrimination is. This is what happened to people. Yes, you will publish your article, but in reality, you are not showing the actual problem, are only assumptions in your mind. So I believe it's good to involve other people because you have different perspective, experiences, and know what happened from the other side. It feels good. It's a good initiative. Very few times people get the opportunity to express themselves on these subjects or how they really feel about it. So I think it's good. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a way of educating other people too. And it should start from there. If more people are given the space to talk more about their experiences openly and more people are able to access that information, things will eventually get better. It is a step forward. So I think it's a good initiative. So the last two people say, I think it's important to have like an opinion of each other because not everyone is thinking in the same way. So for me, it is benefit for you, for me, Victoria, you are learning more. You have a lot of knowledge now, how people think about us, how also we face problems like this discrimination situation all the time. So I think now you know better. And the last one say, participating in this had me feeling so many feelings. I felt angry, happy, and sad, thinking about all the racism me and many others have faced and discrimination we have been through, but most importantly, I think this is a great way to get my voice to be heard. This was so interactive, and I hope in a teeny little way I will be able to change or impact lives through it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was fun, educative, and interactive. So with this, I finish my presentation. I want to thank for the 4 people that I interview. I hope I represent them. From my side, I learn a lot. I deconstruct a lot myself. I know that it's a little seed in me. I hope that I'm showing the same to all of you and that we all take the responsibility after today to stop with the daily racial discrimination that we can listen and see every day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victoria. It has indeed been a very interesting and very touching, moving presentation that you have made through your interviews. You have brought up very crucial issues relating to racial discrimination from around the world and pointed out our responsibilities that we need to wake up to. Thank you very much, Victoria. Let us move on to the next paper that is by Abhishek.
Yes, ma'am.
Abhishek is here? Yes.
Hello. Am I audible,
Yes.
ma'am?
Yes, please, please.
So Abhishek Kasriyar is a postgraduate student at the Department of Human Rights and Human Development of Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. The title of his paper is A Study of the Right to Religion of Indigenous People in India. Over to you, Abhishek.
Victoria, may I have my video? Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm really thankful to all for this opportunity. The title of my paper is A Study of the Right to Religion of Indigenous People in India. As many of us would already know the fact that indigenous people have different religion with different rituals. They worship natures actually. Okay, next slide, please. So here is the abstract. Religion act as a glue for the societies and binds people together with common beliefs, practices, and rituals. And it is also necessary for civilized life. But when some people's religion didn't have the importance and recognition at the national level, the people couldn't feel anymore that the country really belongs to them and have the real intention to uplift them. All people have the right to religious freedom, and also it includes the indigenous people of India. Presently, in the census and other government forms, there is no option to choose Aboriginal religion. Representative of indigenous people said that this scatters the population of tribes in the country and forces them to pick other religions. The tribal communities constitute 12 crores of the country's population, but their religion was not identified by the government. Although there had been a huge demand for the right to choose tribal or aboriginal religion as an option in the census or any other forms. This paper is to focus on the rights available for the indigenous people in India and try to find out why they are denied the basic right, that is the right to religious freedom, or giving them their indigenous religious identity by the government of India. Next slide, please. Introduction. In India, indigenous people are commonly called Adivasis and legally called scheduled tribe. Scheduled tribes is essentially an administrative term used for various purposes, which to give certain specific constitutional privileges and protection for the people that were being historically backward and disadvantaged. The Constitution provides equality to all, prohibits discrimination on the grounds of faith, race, caste, sex, or place of birth, and to freedom of faith and culture and education. The Adivasis want to govern themselves outside of the influence of others, but this self-governing system changed by the Britishers as they introduced the Jamindari system that controls over vast territories, including Adivasis territories for revenue collection. From that point, they began to establish a relationship with the outside world in India. As their culture, beliefs, and religions are different for others, people began to discriminate. And it isn't changed so far after numerous dedicated articles within the Constitution. Next slide, please. History of discrimination of Adivasis. Migrations of people have been taking place for more than 50,000 years in Asia. The entry of Europeans and the colonization of Asia fully changed the relationship between the mainstream communities and tribal communities as they introduced capitalism, private property, and the creation of countrywide market. This broke the traditional economy, which was based on hereditary professions. In the Indian epic, such as Puranas, Ramayana, and Mahabharata, there are many incidences of wars between the forest tribes and the Hindus. According to historians who have undertaken detailed research into Ramayana, have concluded that Lanka, the kingdom of King Ravana and his demons, were an aboriginal tribe, most probably the Gond, which falls under scheduled tribe in today's India. Even today, the Gond holds Ravana, the villain of Ramayana, in high esteem as a chief. Rama, the hero of Ramayana, is additionally known for slaughtering the Rakshasas, means demons, within the forest. In the ancient scriptures, which considered to be scattered by the Hindus, various words are used to refer to Adivasis as almost non-humans. The epics of Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Puranas, Samhitas, and other so-called sacred books refer to Adivasis as Rakshasa, means demons, and Vanara, means monkeys. In medieval India, Muslim ruler also used derogatory words for them, and some of them forced into slavery. Eklavya, one among the archers who belonged to the Adivasi community, was so skillful that the hero of the Aryans, Arjuna, couldn't stand before him. So it's obvious that they assaulted him, cut his thumb, and destroyed his ability to fight, and then the whole story constructed in a way that he accepted Drona as his guru and surrendered his thumb as an offering to the master. Goddess Kali, the goddess of hunters, definitely had a tribal origin. Not much is known about the relationship between the Adivasis and other communities during the Hindu and Muslim rules. There are both references to wars and alliances between the Rajput kingdom and tribals in medieval India and therefore the northeast. They are considered to be Ati Sudra, meaning lower than the untouchable caste. Even today, the people used to refer them as jungli, a derogatory term meaning those who are like wild animals or uncivilized. Due to different cultures, different food habits, and different lifestyles, they don't have any place in the Hindu caste based system. Next slide, please. The situation of Adivasis in modern India. Adivasis are not known as ruler like the other caste of Hindu. However, they continue to face violence and prejudice as they were socially distanced from the very first of the civilization. Today, they are at the lowest point in every indicator of development. This is particularly so with the rise of the Hindutva forces and later on the Christianity forces. None of the Adivasi who had fought against the British have been treated as the part of national struggle for independence. Heroes like Birsa Munda, Kanu Santhal, Kazia Naik are remembered within the songs and stories of the Adivasis only, but ignored within the official textbook. It doesn't matter how much anyone respects the mainstream freedom fighter. When someone gets to know the real ignorance of these people, they were convinced to take revenge from the country as they used to do in the British period. Another story, in the time of Durga Puja, people believed that all the sorrows, tiredness, and regret disappear at this time. It's said that the benevolent goddess comes to triumph over evil and to re-establish good across the wretched earth. Mahasasura is slain, who belong to today's Ashur community, also known as Kherwals, and most commonly known as Santhalis. They have been cast out over the centuries. The Kherwals mourns during the days of Durga Puja. They were uprooted from their native territory in the distant past, and their leader, Hudur Durga, was betrayed and brutally murdered. The foreign invaders of that time, who are known as Aryans, betrayed their forefathers and waged violent wars with them. Among many leaders of that time, Hudur Durga was the last and the greatest of them all. What we I want to ask a question here. Uh, what we do not know as the conflict between the Dev and the Ashura is actually the conflict between the Aryans and the natives. History was exaggerated by the ruler, uh, and the masses are immersed in this official history, and the natives of this land are exploited and downtrodden. A country that has been erased the history of the downtrodden can scarcely be called secular. The Adivasi leader Hudur Durga has been refashioned as Mahasasura and has been reduced to the feet of the foreign woman Durga. A secular state has no problem in crushing upon anyone's belief or religion. In every image of Durga, one can come across that she is murdering Mahasasura. It shows the differences in the social position of Aryans and Ashur. Here I'm asking one question. Here, as most of them are Bengalis, I want to ask you that how far is it right to worship Durga with the picture in which she is murdering Mahasasura? There are many stories of injustice, including the case of Kurmis, one of the tribe who used to Adivasi in the eyes of Britishers, but later on, after independence, the status of scheduled tribe was denied just because they owned lots of land in the Jharkhand and Odisha to set up the several industries. Next slide, please. Adivasis and human rights. United Nations also figured out the ignorance of these people and made some soft laws internationally, even it took very late to made. In the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People, there are several rights are being directed to the states such as right to full freedom, right to full enjoyment, right to self-determination, right to equality, right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, right to take care of and protect, have access and privacy to their religious and cultural sites, right to the utilization and control of their ceremonial objects, and right to repatriation of their human remains. And also, in the Indian Constitution, the rights of tribal people that affirm their autonomy and dignity as set out in the Article 21 under Schedule 5 and 6 is often considered as the core of Adivasi rights, and also in Article 14, that is equality, Article 15, that is non-discrimination, Article 16, equality of opportunity, Article 17, abolition of untouchability, Article 23, right against exploitation, and Article 19 protects freedom of speech, expression, assembly, association, and movement with some restriction. Next slide, please. Scheduled Tribe of India, Religious Democracy. Here it's a very interesting survey done by the Jitendra K. Bajaj in 2011. Here he collected the data of STIs and Christian STIs and found that the number of Christian ST are more even, they are very less in population. What is even more remarkable is that the Christian STs have a much higher share among the promoted officers than among the directly recruited officers. It shows that changing religion is key to development for these people. Herein, Hindus considered them, they belong to them, but on the lower position of the society. And Christians believed that they need to change their religion to be in a big position in society. And they don't have any concrete religion. So, in that way, Christians' beliefs can be considered true practically. Next slide, please. So here's it's the finally the discussion and the conclusion. It's crucial time that everyone should understand people have the religious freedom and everyone have different religions, and other people should make their mind not to disrespect them. In many countries, blasphemy is legal, but few people of specific religion can't take this, as in the case of recent incidences in France. And on the other hand, in India, where blasphemy is illegal, still blasphemy is done, but it is only limited to some groups. People easily make fun of the indigenous people and their culture, food, and languages. In recent days, all have witnessed how some people of specific religions got hurt on so little things and started to do riots in India. People forget to maintain the equilibrium between the religion and the humanity. People who belong to the upper dominant caste and dominant religion should stop being so proud of their culture and religion to create this space for the racial minorities. It's very sad to see there's nearly no or very few professors are found in the higher studies of ST community. Their surname was never used in any commercial movie unless the story belongs to them. Even then, they were not taken for their character in the movie. From the very beginning, after India got independence, they are demanding their religion to be addressed, and further, it didn't motivate people to change their religion into Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam. If India really wants to be called secular, then why they were denied their religion as one of the state religion? But after so much discussion and debate, the Jharkhand government ultimately passed the bill of Sarna religion code and sent it to the central government for implementation. It was supported by all party alliances and opposition except the BJP, that is Bharatiya Janata Party. The representative of Adivasis said that we hope it will bring positive change to our community and will help them to access all the constitutional rights and central support. Thank you, ma'am, for listening me.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. It has indeed been a very interesting discussion that you have initiated regarding the religion of tribal people and how that gets denigrated by the dominant group's discourse. It is indeed a very interesting issue that you have raised. Now, I think we have very little time, but I'm sure someone might have some questions or observations to make. So let us open it to the floor for questions, if there are any questions. Are there any questions? Are there any questions to be asked? Upashana?
No, ma'am. We don't have any questions yet.
Okay, we don't have any questions or observations. In that case, do we wrap up?
Yes, ma'am. We don't have any questions from the audience. So, ma'am, I would like to thank you, especially your presence made the session a lot more captivating and analytical as well. Your leading made the presentations illustrious, and thank you also for leading the session and adding your valuable standpoint on the presentations. Your interpretations expanded the edges of the topic, and ma'am, it rightly added to our knowledge also. Thank you so much, ma'am, for being with us today here. Thank you so much. Ma'am, you are not audible. Ma'am, audible.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
thank you, Upashana. I must say it has been a very, very interesting experience sharing this session. And I have learned a lot myself from the three presentations on very diverse topics, yet three presentations that really link up to show how identity of indigenous people and identities on racial grounds become issues of marginalization and victimization of the people. Not only that, how very importantly, what came up in our session, I think, is how they respond, how they feel, their emotions. These have come up in a very interesting way from three different dimensions in the three presentations. One, from the short stories regarding the owls, the other from the side of the so-called dark-skinned people who are hardly considered as human by the fair people on the basis of their skin color, what they feel about that marginalization, and how those having a distinct religion of their own, how their religion is constantly pushed into the background, pushed under the feet symbolically by the goddess of the upper castes, dominant groups. I think we have had a very, very interesting session. Thank you to all the paper presenters, and thank
Ma'am,
you very much.
we
Yes.
just have only one question, and we just got it recently. I would like to ask Victoria. Oh, the question is here only. The question is from Khan Zahid, who is asking about Indian disparity lead to violent movement. Uh, Victoria, the question, please. Yeah, Indian disparity lead to violent movement issues instead of fraternity. Still, we are often hearing Indian disparity in progressive. Why?
The question is to Victoria.
No, ma'am. The question is asked by Zahid Khan.
No, who is it addressed to? Who is expected to answer this question?
Ma'am,
Of the
we
three
would like.
presenters, under the circumstances, if it is not specifically addressed to any one of them, if the Mr. Khan is not
He
addressing
will
it to
answer,
anyone.
right? Hello. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. You can answer to this question, ma'am.
Normally, questions are not asked to the chair, but since I have been asked to look into this question, the question
ma'am.
once more is, there is a question from my side. Indian disparity leads to violent movements, issues instead of fraternity. Still, we are often hearing Indian disparity is progressive. Why? I would say, the first reality is that in India, there are many grounds of disparity. Disparity also makes for hierarchy. It is not just difference. It is difference with a value. And this value makes for access or not having access to goods and services. So when it comes to not having access to goods and services or denying people access to goods and services, force becomes an ingrained part of the system. Those who deny the access to certain people, are using force. It is a part of the system. When I say force, it's not always a visible force. It is structural in many cases. They are marginalized, and naturally, those who have to resist because of their survival, because of their own identity, when they have to resist, they do not find avenues often within the so-called legal frame or within the so-called accepted discourse as such. So what happens is they go for violent movements, or they at least think that there are no openings within the legal frame. So they go for violent movements. When you hear about that the disparity is progressive, etc., once again, whose voices are you hearing? The audible voices. The audible voices are very often the voices from the top, not the voices of those who are marginalized. So what they try to do, consciously or subconsciously, they try to co-opt from the marginalized those who seem to be initiating the resistance or supporting the resistance to the extent possible in order to maintain the stability of the existing system without upsetting the status quo. They try to introduce certain changes and demonstrate that this disparity is progressive. It is part of the system, and let us accept it as it is. Yes, disparity is desirable. It is good. It is part of the system. It has a positive dimension only provided the different units or elements are on an equal footing. You cannot call it fraternity when it is top down. It is fraternity when you're holding the hands of someone on the same level. So you've got to have a level playing ground for all the sections, and that means those groups which are marginalized need to be given space on that level playing ground. And that means they have to be given access to resources, goods and services, decision making on a level playing ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Any
ma'am.
other questions? Yes.
No, ma'am, we don't have any other questions.
That's
Yes, ma'am, that's it. Ma'am, your screen got frozen again. Hello?
hello, the session comes to an end.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank
Yes,
you, ma'am.
thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for showing this dimension of vulnerability. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Now, I would like to thank all the presenters and participants for being a part of the webinar. Today's session ends here, and the next session will begin tomorrow sharp at 10:30 with the panel Migrants and Refugees. Till then, take care, stay safe, adios.